This is the second part of this manhwa. If you haven't seen the previous chapters, I recommend that you do. Guts and his companion Casca were engaged in an intense battle, fighting to survive after falling into the river and being separated from the rest of their battalion. Now, they find themselves inside a cave, struggling for their survival. Casca dreams of her first encounter with Griffith. He tells her that joining him or not is her own decision. Before she can make her choice, Casca awakens. She turns around and sees Guts crouched at the cave entrance, wetting a piece of cloth for her to use. She realizes that during the night, he also covered her with a makeshift leaf blanket. He informs her about their situation. Casca tries to get up, but Guts encourages her to stay still. Her movement displaces the leaves, and she realizes that she has been stripped of her clothes. Despite Guts' attempts to explain, she punches him in the face and throws pieces of his armor at him. Guts reacts aggressively, telling Casca that if it weren't for her being a woman, he would hit her back. His words remind her of her earlier conversation with Adin, and Casca starts crying, saying that being born a woman wasn't her choice. Realizing that his words have hurt her, Guts tries to console her, but she attacks him again. He easily overpowers her and gives her his dry shirt to wear. They sit at opposite ends of the small cave. Casca laments that out of all the people who could have saved her, it had to be Guts. He asks why she ever joined the band of the Falcon, and Casca responds by telling a story. She speaks of her origins in a small isolated village that was severely impoverished and lacking in food. Going days without eating was common. The village was often raided by enemy soldiers due to its proximity to the border. One day, a noble spotted Casca and offered her parents a large sum of money to buy her. Her parents agreed, and Casca was sent to live with the noble. However, on the way, he made unwanted advances. Casca escaped from the carriage they were in, but the man quickly caught her and pinned her to the ground. Before she could be abused, someone cut off the man's ear. Griffith, her savior who was mounted on his white horse, observed the noble and Casca. Instead of simply killing the noble, Griffith threw his sword to Casca, indicating for her to save herself. Casca did so, stabbing the noble with the sword. Then, Griffith calmed her trembling hands, and Casca developed admiration for her savior. Judo approached them and informed Griffith that he, Corcus, and Pippin, the first members of the band of the Falcon, had finished searching for loot in the noble's carriage. As the band prepared to leave, Casca impulsively asked to join them. Despite the reluctance of the other members to take a young woman with them, Griffith told Casca to do as she pleased, and she was eventually integrated into their group. Griffith commented that she now knew how to fight, but the young Casca reflected that it was Griffith who provided her with her sword in the first place. Casca continues her story. The band of the Falcon gradually grew over time, and somehow they kept winning battles, despite being the children of commoners led by a commoner boy. Eventually, the band became embroiled in a feud with a feudal lord. The noble in question was wealthy and influential, but his reputation stemmed from his taste for children. Young Casca felt disgust seeing the lord's child slaves, but Griffith reassured her. One day, after a battle, Griffith, Casca, and Pippin discovered the corpse of a young man who had recently joined the band. Although Casca never personally knew the boy, Griffith was deeply affected by his death, realizing that the boy had died to help him achieve his dream, and he recognized that the boy looked at him as if he were a hero. From then on, Casca's perspective of Griffith had changed from the idol she once saw in him. A few nights later, Casca noticed Griffith on the balcony of the castle they were stationed in. Casca called out to him, but the lord interested in the boys was up there with Griffith, inviting him to his room. Griffith left with him after one last glance at Casca. The next morning, Casca encountered Griffith bathing in the nearby river. He noticed her and asked her not to leave. When she approached, Griffith asked if she was impure. She asked Griffith why he visited the lord in his room, and her suspicions that they had engaged in sexual relations were confirmed by Griffith. Griffith explained that he didn't sleep with the lord simply out of mutual attraction. Rather, the noble offered Griffith a considerable treasure in exchange, which Griffith needed to cover the growing expenses of the increasingly numerous band of the Falcon. Griffith wanted to honor those who died under his command by achieving his dream as soon as possible. Absorbed in his own words, he began making deep cuts on his arms. Casca interrupted his self-destructive behavior by getting into the water and embracing Griffith from behind. When he turned to her, his melancholy had vanished. Casca concludes her narrative by saying that Griffith isn't naturally strong. Instead, he forces himself to keep going despite the losses he suffers. Casca believes that his goal is so ambitious that the losses must be worthwhile, and she wants to be by his side when he achieves it. As Casca submerges herself and cries into Guts' chest, he hears soldiers outside the cave. Staying silent, Guts and Casca listen to the armed men who wish to claim the reward for Guts and Casca offered by Adin. The men begin searching downstream and closer to the cave, so Guts gives Casca a temporary remedy for her fever to prepare for their escape at nightfall. After searching for a way to climb the cliff for some time, Casca collapses due to the pains in her lower body and her fever, but Guts manages to motivate her by telling her that the enemy forces don't care about the issues she may face as a woman. As they begin to move, Guts notices an arrow heading towards them. He pushes Casca out of its path, but the reality of the situation quickly reveals itself. They have fallen into an ambush and are surrounded by dozens of soldiers under Adin's command. Aden, who has bandaged his face since being injured by Guts, tells Guts and Casca that he plans to take them as prisoners, Guts to torture him and Casca to abuse her. Guts responds with a sarcastic comment that any part of the body the men of Aden put in Casca's mouth, they would lose, a comment that earns him a hit on the head from Casca. The joke has also angered Aden, who orders his men to attack. However, the disparity between their skills and those of Guts and Casca is immediately evident as the latter effortlessly kill a few soldiers before standing back to back, ready to face the remaining dozens. The real fight begins, and Aden orders his men to gang up on Guts and Casca instead of attacking one at a time. Guts, thanks to his large sword and immense strength, is able to easily sweep away his opponents and kill more than one with each strike. Meanwhile, Casca, smaller and more agile, quickly jumps from one opponent to another, killing them swiftly as she advances. Guts and Casca manage to maneuver to be together again, and Aden calls his brother Samson to fight. Despite being the younger of the two, Samson is nearly twice the size of Aden, who is already about twice the size of an average man. Armed with a huge whip with an iron ball, Samson savagely strikes at Guts, whose massive sword allows him to deflect the iron ball instead of having to dodge it. The fight between Guts and Samson intensifies, and both increase the speed of their attacks. As Casca wonders why Guts deflects the blow instead of dodging it, she realizes that he is doing it to protect her rather than himself. She then notices blood seeping from under his armor, and Aden points out the arrow wound he inflicted on Guts that has reopened. Amid Samson's attacks, Guts tells Casca that he will create a path for her to escape from Aden's soldiers. Samson attacks again, but this time Guts doesn't deflect the whip and instead shatters it completely. He seizes the opportunity to kill the bewildered Samson. With him out of the way and Casca's path clear, Guts tells her to go, but she refuses. Suddenly alerted to their plan, Aden orders his crossbowmen to shoot at Casca. They do, but Guts steps in the way of the arrows and blocks them with his armor, though his bare arm is injured. As Guts removes the arrow, he tells Casca not to misunderstand and that he took the hit so she could go back to Griffith and be by his side. Casca watches as Guts prepares to face the rest of Aden's forces alone. Guts urges Casca to leave. With her path clear, she decides to flee but promises to return with Griffith and the band of the Falcon to rescue Guts. Guts blocks the soldiers from pursuing her, killing anyone who tries to surround him to reach her. The soldiers keep their distance, realizing that Guts is too strong of an enemy to face. Aden urges them to fight, but the soldiers hesitate. After deliberation, they decide to attack all at once. Guts eagerly confronts them. As Casca runs through the forest, she stumbles upon an exposed root. She then realizes that soldiers are chasing her. She raises her sword, but she can't fight for long due to her pain and fever, so she keeps running. Meanwhile, Guts continues to fight Aden's soldiers. He can easily cut through their large number. Eventually, a crossbow bolt is shot towards his face, but he blocks it with his bare hand. This new disadvantage prevents him from wielding his huge sword with both hands, as intended in its use. The soldiers pursuing Casca catch up to her once again. Despite her attempts to defend herself, they manage to knock her down and disarm her. The soldiers decide they want to abuse her before killing her and start removing her armor and tearing her tunic. She curses her own helplessness and recalls her earlier conversation with Guts, who told her to return to Griffith. Snapped out of her reverie, she finds a broken tree branch on the ground and uses it to stab the soldier restraining her in the eye. Suddenly freed, Casca rushes toward her sword. Her personal rescue is interrupted by Judo and a large group of band members who have come to rescue both her and Guts. Casca has been saved, but Guts' fight still rages on. He has killed dozens of soldiers, and there are still many left. He wonders why he is risking his life in the dark forest against an impossible opponent, even after Casca escaped long ago, but he continues to swing his sword. He suspects that the battle will last until morning. Casca runs to Judo and, exhausted, collapses into his arms. She hasn't forgotten about Guts and leads the band of the Falcon to his location in an effort to save him. Casca, Judo, and other band members arrive at dawn and find the countless bodies of Aden's soldiers. While Judo is completely astonished that Guts managed to kill so many men, Casca notices Guts leaning against a tree, with another arrow sticking out of his shoulder. Fearing the worst, Casca rushes to him and wakes him by shaking him. His calm but sarcastic response that it will worsen his injuries reassures the mercenaries, especially Casca. Guts is carried back to their camp on a stretcher and is attended to by his physician, who informs him that he will be out of commission for most, if not all, of the remaining campaign. Guts' refusal to give up and his desire to keep fighting angers the physician and worries Casca, although she is relieved that Guts is safe. Griffith is not present as he has to attend a war council. Later, in the night, the band celebrates the return of Guts and Casca. She chats with some soldiers but is whisked away by Judo, who explains that when Griffith was informed that they had fallen from the cliff, he ordered a search party to be organized despite the opposition of several nobles, arguing that Guts and Casca were vital to the band of the Falcon. Casca is moved by Griffith's concern for her, and Judo gives her a bag of elf dust, provided by an elf he met during his days as a traveling performer. Casca rushes to find Guts, whom she finds sitting atop a hill, overlooking the band's camp. Casca removes Guts' bandages and administers the elf dust. As she does so, Guts explains that while fighting 100 men like he did may be impressive, it is not as admirable as what Griffith or Casca do, fighting for a dream, for something noble. He tells her that within the ranks of the Band of the Falcon, there are mercenaries who have their own hopes and dreams, and they all fight for them. Guts compares his dreams to the campfires lit around the camp, easily extinguished by the wind, so they join a bigger and more resilient flame, Griffith's dream. Guts feels that his fire is not with the band. Casca suddenly realizes that he plans to leave her, but he assures her that he will stay with them until their campaign is over. Their conversation is interrupted by Rickard and Pippin, who arrive to inform them that Griffith, upon learning that they were safe, hastily returned to the camp. Casca greets him first, apologizing for going into battle while she was sick. Her apology is undermined by Guts, who playfully spanks her for being too dramatic. Guts leaves with his men to get something to drink, leaving Casca with Griffith. She watches Guts leave, wondering if he truly intends to abandon the Band of the Falcon. Later, during the campaign, Doldrey, a strategically important castle under Tudor's control, is being besieged by the forces of Midland. The castle is said to be impregnable. One of Midland's generals is informed by an infantry soldier that Midland is suffering heavy losses and that Tudor has sent its most powerful regiment of soldiers, the Purple Rhino Knights, to attack Midland's headquarters. Originally, Doldrey was part of Midland, but during the 100-Year War, it was annexed by Tudor. Doldrey is a castle of great strategic importance as it lies on the border between Midland and Tudor. There has been an unexpected stroke of luck. Currently, Tudor is going through an internal succession crisis, so its forces in Doldrey are not at full strength. Midland plans to seize Doldrey during this time. The King of Midland has summoned his generals, advisors, and other resources, including Griffith, to discuss the situation at Doldrey. Although not fully stocked with soldiers, Doldrey is easily repelling Midland's advances. While most of those present in the meeting argue amongst themselves about which course of action to take, Griffith remains silent. The man beside Griffith asks him if he, the legendary White Hawk, could take Doldrey, to which Griffith responds that he could do so if ordered. The sincerity in Griffith's voice surprises everyone present at the meeting, and they burst into more discussions, this time directed at Griffith. The King of Midland silences them and asks Griffith if he could truly capture Doldrey. Griffith answers affirmatively and says that he would only require the Band of the Falcon, instead of all the armies that Midland has to offer. Once again, everyone is stunned by what Griffith says. After some internal deliberation, they conclude that the Band of the Falcon will not constitute a large enough part of Midland's forces for their status as an essential asset to Midland to be necessary, and that the failure of a single seemingly reckless strategic maneuver by Griffith will not harm overall morale. In the end, the King of Midland orders Griffith to mobilize his troops. The meeting concludes, and two generals, Owen and Laban, plan to observe from a distance as Griffith sets his plan in motion. Both seem hopeful that Griffith will emerge victorious and consider the fact that they are fighting alongside the man who potentially will be recognized as the hero of the 100-Year War. They watch as Griffith mounts his horse to leave. Griffith has also noticed them and politely nods his head before departing. In the Band of the Falcon's camp, Guts appears completely relaxed despite the impossible odds, stating that mercenaries have achieved the impossible before. While other members offer their own opinions on the matter, Casca remains silent. Guts notices this and asks her what's wrong. She reveals that the man in charge of defending Doldrey and the man with whom Griffith had a sexual relationship years ago to obtain war funds are the same person, Genin, Supreme Commander of the Northern Battlefront of the Tudor Empire. Guts understands that Griffith may have accepted the mission due to his personal connection with Genin. Inside Doldrey, Adden, who pretended to be dead when the band members came to rescue Guts at the cliff's foot, encounters the leader of the Purple Rhino Knights, General Boscone. Boscone punishes Adden for returning in disgrace by revoking his commander status. Later, Boscone meets with Genin, who informs the general that the force attempting to capture Doldrey is the legendary Band of the Falcon. Boscone becomes excited and eager to confront this seemingly invincible enemy. Genin orders him not to kill Griffith and to bring him back alive. The Band of the Falcon is in position facing Doldrey. In the calm before the battle, Judo and Guts converse. Thanks to Judo's elf dust, Guts' wounds have almost completely healed. Judo can't help but marvel at the enormous structure that is Doldrey, massive thick walls and an imposing inner tower, but Guts trusts that if Griffith has a plan, they will emerge victorious. Boscone has gathered his Purple Rhino Knights outside Doldrey, anticipating the imminent attack. He does not think highly of Griffith's decision to place his band between Boscone's forces and a river, leaving them with no escape route. Boscone wonders if there is a connection between Griffith and Genin but does not dwell on the matter, preferring to focus on the battle. Inside Doldrey, Genin can't stop thinking about Griffith and considers himself fortunate to be able to encounter the White Hawk once again. His obsession is driven by his lust for Griffith. Guts can barely see Doldrey through a dust storm that has arisen arisen, but he is reassured by Griffith, who claims that everything is going according to plan. Griffith advances to take command. Guts looks back at the flag waving with the colors of the Band of the Falcon, considering that this decisive battle may be the last he fights with the band. Griffith orders the attack, and Guts lowers his visor, determined not to let his emotions take control during the battle. Boscone is puzzled by the band dividing its already reduced force in two, but he remains undeterred. The first half of the forces charges directly at the Purple Rhino Knights, led by Guts, who has no trouble cutting through anyone in his path. Guts charges with all his strength against Boscone, who prepares for the impact. The resulting clash causes Guts' helmet to be knocked off and Boscone's ornamental horns to break. The soldiers of both commanders join the fray. Inside Doldrey, Genin has noticed the ferocity with which Boscone is fighting. Worried that he might accidentally kill Griffith, Genin orders his bodyguards to be armed and ride out with him. He intends to personally take command of his forces to ensure that Griffith remains alive. Back outside, Griffith orders the Band of the Falcon to fall back to their headquarters, although the expression on Guts' face reveals a hidden logic in this maneuver beyond the obvious enemy escape. Boscone suspects the reasons behind their retreat, but his fellow soldiers eagerly want to pursue them. Despite Boscone's doubts, Genin, who has joined the battle, orders the pursuit. Noticing that the Purple Rhino Knights are chasing them, Griffith orders the Band of the Falcon to halt and form a formation along the river. Meanwhile, hidden in the dust floating around the river, Casca orders the other half of the band to form up. Tudor's men inside Doldrey can't perceive anything through the dense cloud of dust. With Boscone's knights occupied away from the castle, Casca orders her troops to breach Doldrey's massive impenetrable gates as quickly as possible and sets up a contingent of soldiers to prevent Boscone from finding out that Doldrey has been invaded. Adin, stripped of his command, watches Casca from a window atop Doldrey. Casca's attack on Doldrey is interrupted by the sudden appearance of Adin, dressed in shark-themed armor. Due to his loss of command, all his soldiers have been stationed inside Doldrey, so he takes it upon himself to defend Doldrey. Determined to avenge his brother Samson's death, Adin prepares to duel Casca. On the battlefield, Genin is informed that, despite all his attempts, his soldiers can't reach Griffith due to a lone man blocking their path, Guts. Boscone intervenes to personally confront Guts, and the clash of their weapons is so swift that the soldiers watching can't perceive it. Casca, no longer affected by her period, easily defeats Adin in battle, causing him to fall down a staircase. Near the river, Rickard is saved from death by Pippin's timely intervention. They, along with Corcus, begin to feel that the fight is desperate, considering that the Band of the Falcon is clearly outnumbered. Griffith has stopped fighting to observe Guts' fierce battle against Boscone. Guts comments that he feels worse than when he fought Adin's 100 men and recalls his fight against Zod, but he decides that the current situation is much less desperate than the previous ones. Back inside Doldrey, Casca fights to stay awake due to a toxin placed on the tips of Adin's arrows. She manages to dodge his attacks, but just barely. One of his spear throws manages to knock off her helmet. Eventually, Adin corners her against the inner wall of Doldrey. Quickly improvising a plan, she evades what would have been the fatal blow by using her sword to jump over Adin's spear. She somersaults over him, and upon landing, swiftly slashes Adin's face, opening his cheeks and widening his mouth. In a combination of shock and blood loss, Adin falls dead. Casca orders the soldiers who witnessed her battle to continue the assault. Boscone prepares to charge at the isolated and injured Guts. Several members of the Band of the Falcon try to intercept Boscone's attack, but he knocks them down without losing momentum. All seems lost until the rider on the distant cliff overlooking the battlefield throws his sword, a massive axe-like blade, across the impossible distance, landing it right in front of Guts, surprising all the soldiers present. Griffith is the first to react and shouts to Guts to wield the weapon. Guts does so and manages to block Boscone's charge with his new sword. With a powerful strike, Guts beheads Boscone and his horse as well. Tudor's army, with the exception of Genin, suffers a great loss of morale. Genin orders them to fight, but their spirits are further broken when they realize that the Band of the Falcon has captured Doldrey as well. The Tudor soldiers don't know what to do. Guts informs them that the Band of the Falcon has won the battle, and Griffith orders to kill the remnants of the enemy forces if they refuse to flee. Despite Genin's orders to stay and fight, his troops flee. In the commotion, he is knocked off his horse, and when he comes to, he realizes that Griffith is seated on his own horse, looking down at him with contempt. Genin appears both elated and terrified at the sight of Griffith. On one hand, they are on opposite sides of the war. On the other, Genin hopes that the non-existent, mutual attraction they have for each other will convince Griffith to spare his life. Genin tells Griffith that he wishes to see him again after the night they shared, but Griffith's lack of response prompts Genin to ask if Griffith is resentful towards him. Griffith responds that he isn't, explaining that their night together was merely a means to an end, the realization of his dream. Griffith adds insult to injury by explaining that the money Genin gave him to ensure the survival of his men made everything up to that point possible. As Genin screams in rage at being used, Griffith tells him that having Genin spreading rumors about the hawk would be inconvenient and kills him by impaling him with his sword through the eye. Inside Doldrey, the band is celebrating their victory and hunting down the last remnants of Tudor's army within the walls. Casca continues to suffer from the pain of her arrow wound but rejects the help of passing mercenaries. Eventually, she is found by Guts, who still wields the massive blade. He helps her to her feet, and together they gaze upon the battlefield where Griffith is being praised and cheered by the band of the Falcon. Casca tells Guts that seeing Griffith being celebrated in this manner makes her feel very distant from him. In response to this, Guts picks her up in his arms to bring her to Griffith's side. Before leaving the castle, Guts gives a suspicious look to the oversized sword. He decides not to dwell on it and departs with Casca. On the cliff, the rider and sword thrower, Zod, contemplates the upcoming event called the Eclipse before turning around and riding off into the distance, leaving Doldrey behind. Minister Foss meets with 5 hooded men, his allies in a conspiracy, to discuss Griffith's constant rise in Midland's status. According to Foss, the King of Midland plans to grant Griffith the title of general and elevate the band of the Falcon to the same status as Midland's most esteemed regiments. They conspire to assassinate Griffith by pouring antiurus poison into his cup during the celebration of his ascent. Those surrounding Foss fear the plan will fail, but the Queen of Midland, who until then only Foss knew was present, guarantees that she will personally ensure Griffith's death if their plan fails. While the Queen converses with Foss's co-conspirators, Foss ponders to himself. Thanks to his machinations, the Queen has decided to involve herself in the conspiracy. The Queen also looks back and recalls the chain of events that led her to join Foss's plan. She, despite being married to the King of Midland, maintained a passionate love affair with her brother, Julius. Foss shared his suspicions that Julius was killed by Griffith, and this, along with the fact that Foss's friends are nobles whose positions are threatened by Griffith's meteoric rise, has provided Griffith with many enemies. The meeting concludes with Foss asking his co-conspirators to sign a blood oath. In the streets of Wyndham, the band of the Falcon is warmly welcomed by the citizens of Midland, who celebrate their victory at Doldrey. While most members of the band revel in their newfound fame, Guts remains lost in thought. Gaston quickly brings him back to reality and tells him that 3 years ago, mercenaries would never have dreamed of such treatment. Guts attributes their success to Griffith, thinking that only he could have taken an impossible goal so far. Griffith fails to notice that Princess Charlotte is calling him from her balcony. The Queen of Midland, Foss, and their accomplices also observe Griffith from a high balcony. According to Foss's colleagues, everything is in place for Griffith's death. A guard enters the room and hands Foss a letter, which he reads in private. The contents seem to greatly disturb him, and the Queen asks if everything is alright. Foss responds that he's fine but turns around to leave, seething with anger toward the letter's sender. On the eve of the band of the Falcons' return to Wyndham, a banquet is held in their honor. As the band consists of several thousand soldiers, a troop of them presents themselves in their place. They are Griffith, Guts, Casca, Judo, Corcus, Pippin, and Rickard. For the first time, the regular members of the band dress up for a formal party in the presence of aristocrats. Of the 7, Griffith is undoubtedly the most comfortable in the situation. As he enters the banquet hall, he is besieged by women who want to get to know him. However, once there's no room to reach Griffith, the other male members are quickly surrounded and interrogated as well. Guts, in particular, is admired for his defeat of Boscone. He soon becomes overwhelmed and escapes from the horde of women who are still fawning over the other male mercenaries. Laban and Owen also attend the banquet and realize that other nobles are staring at Griffith. They discuss how Griffith's legendary and rapid ascent attracts people who want to prevent him from reaching new heights. When Guts sits on one of the benches lining the walls of the hall, he spots Casca, who, like the men among the mercenaries, is surrounded by members of the opposite sex. She, in turn, sees Guts observing, elbows him in the chin in response, and drags him to the terrace of the banquet hall, which is empty of people. Outside, Casca comments that she's not accustomed to wearing dresses and asks Guts if his muscular physique, developed after years of fighting, makes her look odd in a dress. Guts assures her that she looks better than the women surrounding Griffith. He tells her she should ask Griffith to dance, but she refuses, fearing he'll step on her feet. Casca begins to interrogate Guts, asking him what could have led him to attend a formal banquet. He responds that the party is the result of what Griffith has achieved so far, and he wants to see it with his own eyes. Casca asks if he's being serious, but before he can answer, the crowd inside starts cheering, welcoming the king, queen, and princess of Midland to the dance. Casca is about to go back inside, inviting Guts to join her, but he decides to stay outside a while longer. Before she enters the hall, Guts calls out to her but decides he has nothing to say. He thinks to himself that there is another reason he came to the dance, a reason that the rest of the band, except for Griffith, is unaware of. Inside, the King of Midland formally addresses the crowd. He summarizes the hardships that Midland has endured in the war, announces that Midland and Tudor have signed an armistice, thus ending the war, thanks everyone present for being their allies, and concludes with the big news that he intends to grant the entire band of the Falcon the highest title of ennoblement and a name change to the White Phoenix Knights. Additionally, Griffith will be promoted from Count to General of the White Phoenix Knights. The commanders of the band of the Falcon's units will also be promoted, receiving the title of knights and elevated to nobility. All the band members present in the hall are stunned by the news that they will soon be nobles. Amidst the cheers of the crowd, Griffith looks outward, sees Guts, and smiles affectionately at him. The nobles acclaim the members of the Band of the Falcon, and the few who remain silent are the men who despise Griffith, the nobles Owen and Laban, and the Queen of Midland, who quietly contemplates that Griffith's assassination is near. In an empty corner of the room, Minister Foss stands with two of his co-conspirators. Foss is visibly worried but assures his friends that he's fine when they ask. The servants bring out the wine. One servant, in particular, is strange as his tray only holds one glass of wine. Discreetly, he adds poison to it and serves it to Griffith, who accepts it. The king toasts to the Band of the Falcon, and everyone drinks. Moments later, Griffith collapses, seemingly dead. This turn of events causes a huge commotion in the hall. Casca and the other band members rush to Griffith's body, and Charlotte's legs give way, and she falls to her knees, stunned. Owen and Laban order the guards to seal all the exits. Guts, who was already outside the banquet hall, has completely left the area. The servant who poisoned Griffith has also left the building. As he flees the banquet hall on horseback, he crosses paths with a mysterious hooded swordsman wearing a large feathered hat, who swiftly beheads the assassin with a single strike of his large sword. As he adjusts his hat, the swordsman is revealed to be Guts. Later that night, after being allowed to leave the banquet hall, the Queen of Midland, Minister Foss, and their accomplices celebrate the success of the assassination in a tall, narrow tower in Wyndham. Despite their plan going perfectly, Foss still appears quite agitated, which the Queen notices, but her suspicions are dismissed by Foss. He informs her that his subordinates have disposed of the assassin, so there is no chance of their names being made public. Foss leaves the building, claiming he wants to see the fruits of his labor. After he departs, the Queen thanks everyone present for their help in Griffith's assassination. Her good mood is quickly shattered when thin columns of smoke rise from the floor of the building. After a brief investigation, the tower's inhabitants decide to evacuate, but they are unable to do so because the door is stuck. Several of the Queen's accomplices grab the table they were sitting at to break the door. Moments after the first impact, an explosion on the other side of the door tears it off its hinges and incinerates everyone except the Queen and a few others. She rushes to the window to call for help, but there is only one person there to see her, Griffith. In a state of shock, the Queen briefly forgets about her predicament. Despite the doctors ensuring that Griffith was truly dead, he stands before her. He explains that the poison was nothing more than a hyoscyamus-based narcotic administered in a small enough dose to induce a temporary death like ecstasy, and the doctors were deceived into believing he had actually died. One of the men in the tower pleads for his life but is silenced by the Queen. Griffith reveals that he always knew of their plans in secret and actively participated in their downfall, contrasting with their intrigues from behind their desks. The Queen angrily exclaims that she won't tolerate being killed by a mere commoner like Griffith. Calmly, Griffith replies that on the battlefield, there are no seats for spectators, and those who die in war are ultimately recognized not as royalty, nobility, or commoners, but as the defeated. He then walks away as the tower and his political enemies are consumed by flames. As he leaves the scene, Griffith encounters Foss, who is deeply concerned about the entire situation. Griffith attributes Foss's unease to either betraying his comrades or participating in regicide. Foss asks Griffith how he found out about his plans. Griffith reveals that when he first met Foss, he sensed the fear Foss had for him, so he knew Foss would never allow his existence under normal circumstances. Foss realizes that the trembling he experiences does not stem from betraying his comrades or participating in the Queen's murder. Rather, he fears the unsettling air of dread that emanates from Griffith. Griffith breaks a blood oath that Foss had made previously, claiming it is no longer necessary, and tells the minister that he hopes they can be friendly from now on. Griffith instructs Foss to follow him to a watermill far from the Queen's death site, where Foss is reunited with his daughter, Elise, who was kidnapped by 5 bribed men, whom Foss originally conspired with to kill Griffith, at Griffith's behest. Griffith hands the 5 men a sack of gold as a reward for their services, and they leave. As the 5 men continue on their way, they consider the possibility of betraying Griffith if he severs ties with them. Unbeknownst to them, Griffith has even planned for this contingency. They cross paths with Guts, still disguised with his feathered hat, who kills them. Afterwards, Griffith, who had been following the 5 men, meets up with Guts, who breathes a sigh of relief now that Griffith's plan has come to fruition. Griffith tells Guts to leave the gold with the dead men because, despite being dead, they had earned it. Having left all the dirty work to Guts while his own hands remain clean, Griffith asks Guts if the swordsman considers him cruel. In response, Guts scolds Griffith for asking such a question to someone like him, who has killed 100 men without anyone's help. Furthermore, Guts reminds Griffith that this is just another necessary part of the path to realizing his dream, to which Griffith visibly calms down. As they both move forward together, Guts tells Griffith about the amusing experience of seeing Casca in a dress. Guts and Griffith have returned to Wyndham, where Griffith surprises the other members of the Band of the Falcon by revealing that he is truly alive. He is warmly welcomed by all of them, and after savoring the emotional scene, Guts leaves. The Queen's funeral takes place several days later. Rumors circulate that her death and the attempt on Griffith's life were carried out by Tudor assassins or perhaps by a third party aiming to hinder the armistice between Midland and Tudor. A month after the funeral, late at night, Guts gathers all his belongings, except for the armor he wore and the now broken sword he wielded as the leader of the raiders, and sets off from Wyndham. He is discovered by Casca, who is in her room watching the snowfall. Knowing what he intends to do, she quickly dresses and runs after him. She catches up to him just before he leaves the perimeter of Wyndham and asks if he is really leaving the band of the Falcon. He remains silent. Casca tries to use their newfound friendship as an incentive for him to stay, but he cannot be convinced, as he has long known that he cannot find and fulfill his own dream while crushed under the immense weight of Griffith's ambition. Judo and Corcus come out and find them talking, having been passed by Casca in the hallway as she ran to catch up with Guts. Judo asks Guts to come back with them to Wyndham to talk. Casca, who is left alone in the snow, decides to run and alert Griffith of the situation, hoping he can persuade Guts to stay. Judo has led Guts and Corcus to a tavern, where Judo and Guts talk while Corcus flirts with the waitress. Guts confesses to Judo that his decision to leave the band was made before their mission to recapture Doldrey. Corcus, who dislikes Guts' words, scolds him for throwing away everything he gained during his time in the band, his comrades, his social status, his own reason for being. Guts agrees and states that the problem is the fact that he only has a purpose while he is with the band. He recalls Griffith's words during his conversation with Charlotte by the fountain. A man who lives without purpose, without his own dream, has no place by Griffith's side. Guts wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with Griffith in life, not just watch him from within the band of the Falcon. Corcus exclaims that Guts is only in his current position thanks to Griffith and adds that Griffith is an anomaly, as he is witnessing his extremely ambitious dream come true. Guts remains steadfast in his own conviction, wanting to have and fulfill his own dream. Corcus tells Guts that very few people are capable of fulfilling a lifelong dream, and for him, an unrealized dream is just a pile of shit. When Guts asks Corcus if he has something similar, Corcus leaves the tavern. Judo reveals to Guts that Corcus used to lead a band of thieves before joining the band of the Falcon, and Judo himself, despite boasting superior sword and knife skills, has never been the absolute best at anything, so he decided to hitch his wagon to Griffith's success. Although Judo doesn't understand why Guts would leave behind his knighthood and nobility in search of a dream, he admits that his initial assessment of Guts finding a place to belong within the band, which happened 3 years prior on the fortress parapets where the band was stationed, was mistaken. Judo hopes that Guts can find that something and offers to accompany him on his journey. As they walk through Wyndham, Judo asks Guts about the nature of his relationship with Casca. He has noticed how close they have become in recent months and urges Guts to give it a try. Guts decides not to, considering his relationship with Griffith. Judo explains that Casca can't be with Griffith. Now that the war between Midland and Tudor is over, Griffith has no chance to prove his military worth, so his most likely path to royalty is through Princess Charlotte, who, after the deaths of Julius and Adonis, is now the sole heir to the throne of Midland. Guts remembers the conversation he had with Griffith after the Queen's assassination. Griffith had asked him not to mention that they were behind any of the killings to the other band members, wanting to preserve his idealized image for them. Judo continues, saying that everyone who stood in Griffith's way is already gone, and with the princess infatuated with him, it seems to be only a matter of time until Griffith fulfills his dream. He also adds that Casca's devotion to Griffith is because he gave her a fresh start, a new life, and that's why what she feels for him resembles less love and more worship. Griffith, if forced to choose between Charlotte and Casca, would choose the former, who can further his dream. Guts tells Judo that, although he admires Casca, he's not good for her while he has his eyes set on Griffith, and they leave it at that. However, just outside the defensive wall of Wyndham, before Guts can even take a few steps, he encounters the figures of Casca, Corcus, Rickert, Pippin, and Griffith, blocking his path. Rickert asks Guts if he doesn't like the band of the Falcon. Griffith asks Guts if he truly intends to leave the band of the Falcon, which Guts confirms. Rickert pleads with Guts not to go. Judo tells him that the decision is Guts alone, and he has no right to stop him. Suddenly, Corcus approaches Guts and reproaches him for always harboring a secret hatred toward him and how he has thought 1 or 2 times about stabbing him in the back during combat. He concludes that he dislikes Guts because of his ever-present scowl. Corcus finishes his tirade by telling Guts that he could never compare to Griffith. Guts calmly thanks the band members for all the time he has spent with them. He looks at Casca and remembers Judo's words about her. He smiles but doesn't speak. He simply walks past her with the intention of leaving. His path is blocked once again, this time by Griffith, whose sword is drawn. Griffith reminds Guts that he earned his loyalty by defeating him in a duel and expects Guts to earn his freedom in the same way. Guts wonders aloud why they couldn't part with a simple farewell and unsheathes his own sword, which gleams in the light of the morning sun. Casca steps between Guts and Griffith, urging them to sheathe their swords, but Guts tells her to step aside. Griffith says nothing, but his gaze betrays his determination to keep Guts from leaving. Pippin finally arrives to forcefully remove Casca from between them. She asks the others why they don't intervene, and Judo calmly reminds her that as mercenaries, What is taken by the sword must be reclaimed by the sword, and it's not their place to interfere. Guts observes as a resolute look spreads across Griffith's face. He recalls Griffith's words to Charlotte that night by the fountain and mentally reaffirms his decision to leave judo. Although Corcus believes Griffith will easily defeat Guts, recognizes that Guts' many acrobatics on the battlefield have honed his skills to the point where he and Griffith, who is not the same as before, are evenly matched. Guts and Griffith remain frozen. Guts decides that the impending duel is a much more fitting end to their association than a simple farewell. He feels an odd calmness come over him, even though the man he is about to fight is the only living human who has surpassed him in combat. Casca convinces herself that Griffith will win the duel, and everything will continue as usual. Suddenly, she realizes how much she wants Guts to stay. Griffith evaluates Guts and realizes that Guts is not in his usual heated mindset that he enters during battle. Instead, he is incredibly relaxed. Griffith recognizes this as Guts' absolute determination to leave and decides that he won't allow it. He is also aware of how much Guts has progressed as a warrior and determines that he must win with the first strike, lest his own sword shatter upon impact with Guts' broadsword or slip on the thick snow. Griffith mentally reviews his plan of attack, deflect Guts' sword and drive his own saber into Guts' shoulder. Griffith quickly realizes that if his movements falter even slightly, his saber might end up striking Guts' head. He decides it's better for Guts to die than to be allowed to leave. The fall of a heap of snow from a nearby conifer signals the beginning of the duel. Both men brandish their swords at blinding speeds, but the fight ends as quickly as it starts. Griffith's sword shatters under the weight of Guts' sword, and Guts stops his own sword just centimeters away from burying itself in Griffith's shoulder. Griffith drops the hilt of his sword and kneels in defeat, clutching his wrist. Guts calmly sheathes his sword and walks past Griffith without looking back. Casca calls out to Guts, but he doesn't respond. Guts compares his defeat to Griffith as a small stone thrown in the path of Griffith's pursuit of his dream, and that over time, Griffith will surpass it and continue moving forward. Guts has freed himself from Griffith's clutches in the Band of the Falcon. Alone, Guts camps in the forest for the night. A noise in the shadows startles him, and when he unsheathes his sword to confront the threat, it turns out to be just a wolf. Guts considers that being alone after years of sleeping among an army of people has made him nervous. He begins to doubt himself and his decision to leave. Suddenly, Guts feels a tremendous presence coming from behind him. He unsheathes his sword to face what he assumes is a monster, but there is nothing there. His mind immediately conjures images of Nosferatu Zod. However, there's no time to relax, as Guts once again feels a threatening presence behind him. He swings his sword wildly but only cuts through the air. Hearing a rustling noise from the dark underbrush, Guts braces himself for Zod's appearance, but instead, a mysterious rider materializes, clad in eerie skeleton-themed armor, giving off an otherworldly vibe. Speaking with a hollow voice, and despite his malevolent presence, the Skull Knight addresses Guts as the struggler and tells him about an event that will take place in a year, known as the Eclipse. Displaying a strange knowledge of Guts' past, he tells him that being born from a dead woman and spending his whole life on the battlefield, constantly on the edge of death, has given him the ability to escape it. He also tells Guts that he and his friends will also face unimaginable tragedy and death. The Skull Knight then turns around and departs, his presence fading into the night. That same night, in Wyndham, Princess Charlotte gazes wistfully out of the window amidst the rainy night. Her maids believe her apparent melancholy is the result of the accumulated deaths of Julius, Adonis, and the Queen of Midland. The maids leave, and as Charlotte steps away from the window, she startles at a knock. Outside, Griffith stands among the branches of a nearby tree and silently asks to enter through the window. Charlotte opens the window, and Griffith greets her warmly. He asks her to invite him into her room and keep his visit a secret to avoid tarnishing her reputation. He jumps in through the window, drenched, but Charlotte embraces him and tells him that she feared for his life every day while he was in battle. She laments that, after the happy event of his return, her stepmother died that same night. As she breaks down in his embrace, a possessed look appears on Charlotte's face, and Griffith holds her tightly and kisses her. Despite her initial surprise, Charlotte quickly succumbs to her desire and gets lost in the kiss. Griffith leads her to the bed, noticing that she trembles. He commands her to cast aside her fears and sadness as he removes her dress. At her inn in Wyndham, Casca crosses paths with Judo, Corcus, Pippin, and Rickert, and she asks if they know where Griffith has gone. They reply that they haven't seen Griffith since Guts' departure earlier that day. Disheartened, Casca heads to Guts' former room and caresses the hilt of his old broken sword. Griffith and Charlotte have progressed in their sexual relationship. Charlotte moans with pleasure and ecstasy, but Griffith remains silent, his thoughts solely on Guts' departure. One of Charlotte's maids hears noises coming from her room. She peeks through the keyhole and sees Griffith and Charlotte engaging in intercourse and flees the scene. After their lovemaking, Charlotte falls asleep from exhaustion. Griffith remains awake, tears in his eyes, his hand touching the spot on his shoulder where Guts' sword grazed. Overwhelmed by grief, Griffith embraces himself, curling up into a ball. The next morning, Charlotte wakes up in an empty room. She calls out to Griffith, but there's no response. What she does find is the stone knight that she had given to Griffith before his departure to battle. He has returned it to her as he had promised. Charlotte peers under the sheets of her bed, where she sees blood, the result of her loss of virginity. Griffith escapes from his room through the same path he entered, but he doesn't get very far as he is quickly surrounded by guards. Outnumbered and unarmed, Griffith is forced to submit. The leader of the soldiers orders them to take Griffith away. Charlotte is met by her father, who bursts into her room. She feigns ignorance, but the king notices the broken blood vessels on her neck and the rainwater on the floor. He pulls back the sheets of the bed and sees the blood. Suddenly realizing the situation, the king looks at Charlotte and speaks her name. Griffith has been imprisoned in a dark dungeon, suspended by his wrists, wearing only his pants and his beharit. The king enters the room with a whip. He tells Griffith how disappointed he is in his actions, after having had great hopes for the young general. He uses the whip against Griffith, who makes no sound and almost seems detached from the entire situation. The king continues to whip Griffith as he talks about how he loves his young but impulsive daughter and how he feels defeated when compared to the extent of life. How, despite the war with Tudor coming to an end, another one is bound to break out. The king asserts that Griffith has stolen his only source of warmth in the world. Griffith suddenly understands why the king never made preparations for Charlotte's wedding, deducing that the king harbors a secret lust for Charlotte and is motivated more by jealousy toward Griffith than by the justice of social taboo. Additionally, Griffith explains to the king that the prosperity of his kingdom was not his doing but that of his advisors and military experts. Griffith's words cause the king to fiercely whip him until he finally collapses from exhaustion. The king orders his executioner, a small deformed man with a cleft lip and protruding forehead, to inflict upon Griffith the worst pain as long as he still breathes and keep him alive. After ordering his guards to ensure the secrecy of Griffith's transgression to the point of killing anyone spreading rumors that his daughter has had relations with Griffith, the king leaves while telling Griffith that his ambitions have been punished and he will never rise again. The king visits Charlotte in her room. His daughter has been sedated for crying upon learning of Griffith's arrest. The king gazes at Charlotte's body, considering the fact that Griffith has seen and experienced every part of her. Trembling, the king unbuttons Charlotte's dress to see her breasts. Lust overwhelms him, and Charlotte wakes up feeling her father's tongue on her breasts. She exclaims in fear and disgust. Griffith sits alone in the dungeon, chained to a wall, realizing that his dream will be forever out of reach. Charlotte's scream startles the king, who backs away from her. He briefly apologizes before his lust takes hold of him again. He pounces on her, holds her wrists, and tries to spread her legs, earning him a kick from his daughter to his face. With the sudden eye injury weakening him, he flees Charlotte's room, blaming Griffith for the acts he just committed. At that moment, Charlotte collapses on her bed, begging Griffith to save her. The band of the Falcon has left Wyndham and waits in a field on horseback. They have been deceived into believing that Griffith has ordered them to gather there. The distant sound of hooves is heard, and Pippin, the first to realize what is happening, shouts for everyone to run. A rain of arrows reaches the mercenaries, killing some and injuring others. Soon, they find themselves surrounded by many cavalrymen, and they all realize that these riders are from Midland. Casca takes command and orders the band to form ranks. In the dungeon, Griffith is receiving a brutal physical punishment from the deformed man. He receives praises from the executioner for not making any noise while being mistreated. Suddenly, the executioner notices the beharit that Griffith wears around his neck. He tears it off Griffith's skin and stares at the strange ornament. The beharit opens its eyes, surprising the executioner, who drops it. The beharit falls through a grate and into a sewer below Wyndham, and Griffith watches as it floats away. 1 year later, in a castle far from Wyndham, a noble observes as many knights, warriors, and commoners perform feats of strength, skill, and jousting in a tournament. According to the noble, his combat tournaments have gained legendary fame in many countries. It seems that his claims have merit, as two warriors enter the arena: Valencia, a veteran of the 100 Years' War born in Tudor, and Silit, a dark-skinned masked figure of unknown origin. Despite Valencia's enormous advantage in size and strength, he can't land a hit on the much more agile Silit. Finally, Silit reveals what appears to be brass knuckles, but with 3 blades protruding from the knuckle area at different angles. He catches Valencia's titanic blade with these weapons and cleaves the blade in 2. The terrified Valencia admits defeat. The next participant to step into the ring is Guts, who, with the permission of the tournament's host, prepares to fight against Silit. He provokes Silit to attack first, and Guts easily evades the rapid strikes. Silit tries to use a blade on the tip of his boot to stab Guts in the neck, but it is also easily blocked by Guts, who uses the hilt of his sword to intercept Silit's leg at the ankle. With the other foot, Silit attempts the same move, but it is also blocked, this time by Guts' hand. With both of Guts' hands occupied, Silit leans back to stab Guts in the abdomen, but Guts is faster and strikes Silit on the side with the flat part of his sword. The impact of the blow sends Silit flying through the fence surrounding the ring. The tournament's host comes out to personally greet Guts, very impressed by the skills of the great swordsman. His intention is to hire Guts to work for him, but Guts declines the offer, as he only participated in the tournament to test his luck against strong opponents. The noble shows slight disappointment and talks to Guts about a group of bandits camping in a nearby forest, notable for being led by a highly skilled female warrior. Apparently, most of the bandits in the group were originally from a disgraced mercenary group allied with Midland called the Band of the Falcon. Guts realizes that the woman leading the bandits is Casca. Two armored men observe the hidden camp of what remains of the Band of the Falcon, now a small group of mercenaries led by Casca. They don't number 100, and most of the members are injured. Casca is about to faint while examining a map when she is found by Judo, who brings her food. An undercover unit has been sent to Wyndham, and Judo informs her on their behalf that Griffith is being held in an ancient underground prison, and it is not uncommon to hear screams and moans of pain coming from his cell. In the past month, however, the noises have ceased. Judo assures Casca that he is doing his best and tells her to eat and rest. He leaves, and before she can take a spoonful of stew into her mouth, tears fill her eyes. The bowl slips from her hands, and she collapses onto the table. Judo returns to Rickert, Pippin, and Corcus, who survived the ambush outside of Wyndham. Their conversation reveals that they are planning to rescue Griffith from prison and rebuild the Band of the Falcon. One of the men guarding the camp is killed by a sharp-edged throwing ring. The two armored men, along with many others, are mercenaries led by Silit, who wants to test the supposed legendary strength of the Band of the Falcon. The commotion awakens Casca, who immediately takes command and barks orders at the mercenaries. She comes face to face with Silit. They fight, but Casca's exhaustion, combined with Silit's unorthodox fighting style, only allows her to evade. In the end, she manages to immobilize him and orders him to accept defeat and call the band members or she will kill him. She remains silent, but before Silit can kill her, he receives a boot to the back of his neck that sends him flying. Casca looks at her savior, Guts. She tells him not to be easily defeated and smiles at him. Guts' return immediately boosts the morale of the Band of the Falcon. He tells Casca that he wants to face Silit alone, and she agrees, fleeing. Silit, now aware of Guts' identity as the 100-Man Slayer, understands why it was so difficult to defeat him in the previous combat tournament. He retrieves 2 more blade rings, called chakrams, from his spaulders and tosses them in the air. They fly toward Guts from different directions in a pincer movement, but Guts extends a finger and lifts the hilt of his sword, catching the rings from the air. Silit decides to use his ultimate weapons, the Urumi, which are swords with multiple flexible and thin blades like paper that extend several meters like ribbons. His first strike is dodged by Guts, who receives a cut on his cheek. Guts manages to evade the Urumi for a while, but stops when one of Silit's men gets caught in the whip-like motion of the swords. Guts assumes a two-handed stance, similar to the one he used against Zod, and waits. Silit, unaware of what Guts is planning, creates a whirlwind of blades and throws them all at Guts. Guts swings his sword upward before the Urumi make contact. The resulting air pressure deflects them from their trajectory. Guts charges at Silit through the ribbon blades, which Silit is able to switch weapons quickly enough to block Guts' strike. However, the impact shatters Silit's weapons and rips off his turban. His soldiers have decided to retreat, and a masked Silit leaves with them, not before memorizing Guts' name and swearing that they will cross paths again. Guts releases the tension in his muscles and locks eyes with Casca. After sharing a tense moment with Casca, all the members of the Band of the Falcon gather around Guts, delighted that he has returned. Their reunion is interrupted by Casca, who orders the mercenaries to move their camp now that Silit and his men know its location. After finding a new camp, the mercenaries explain to Guts that a day after his departure, a depressed Griffith was captured, and the band turned into a wanted group of thieves, their numbers reduced to less than a fifth. They also mention how, after rescuing them from Midland's trap, Casca was named de facto leader, and they conclude with the information that Griffith's location has been discovered, and they plan to rescue him. Guts comments that it's fortunate that the place he has returned to still feels familiar to him. Guts had been unaware of their troubles due to his seclusion while training in the mountains. When questioned by Judo, Guts responds that, for him, he discovered that nothing feels more real than wielding the sword. Guts becomes further informed about their situation. According to Judo, the injuries Casca suffered against Midland's cavalry plunged her into a 3-day coma, during which she called out for Griffith and Guts. Later, when Casca finishes her tasks in the camp, she finds Guts and asks him to follow her to a secluded area, near a waterfall. Alone, Casca tells Guts to unsheath his sword. He successfully blocks her swift strike but still doesn't understand why she is attacking him. Instead of fully unsheathing his sword, he keeps it sheathed on his back and only uses the exposed parts of the blade to block. Her barrage of attacks indicates that she truly wants to harm or kill him. Eventually, Guts takes advantage of her reckless attacks, trips her with his foot, and as she slowly rises, he says that she blames Guts for Griffith's situation in the massacre of the Band of the Falcon. She charges again, shouting that Guts' departure from the band caused their downfall, but Guts grabs her hand, thinking that she is not in her right mind for blaming him for something he had no control over. Suddenly, he realizes that she may be right, and he startles when she points the sword at his nose. They continue fighting, with Casca screaming about how Guts became Griffith's reason to persevere, and when he left, Griffith lost all his support. She exclaims that Guts made Griffith weak. This confuses him, recalling Griffith's hunched posture after defeating him in their fight outside Wyndham. At the same time, Casca's sword pierces through the plates of his armor, causing a superficial wound. Guts grabs the blade with his bare hand, pulls it out of the wound, and says that he acted the same way as Griffith did when he left in pursuit of his dream. He tightens his grip on Casca's sword blade so forcefully that his hand bleeds, and despite her pleas, he doesn't let go, causing her to snatch it away before she gets hurt further. She tells Guts that she was lying when she said she wanted to be Griffith's sword. Instead, she admits that she loved Griffith and was jealous of Charlotte, despite knowing how likely it was for Charlotte and Griffith to marry. Thus, her own dream was shattered before her. Accepting the fact that she has no place beside Griffith, Casca asks Guts to take charge of protecting the band of the Falcon. She leans over the edge of the cliff they are standing on, intending to throw herself into the waterfall. Guts reacts quickly enough to grab her hand and, with effort, lift her back up, but his wounded hand bleeds in the process. He tosses her away from the cliff's edge to safety, and when he stands up, he is crying, devastated by how he always seems to get hurt when it comes to her. It weighs heavily on his chest, and he sobs. Guts gives her a reassuring kiss on the head. To his surprise, Casca leans her head back, and their lips meet as they embrace in front of the waterfall. Guts and Casca have moved away from the cliff to a nearby tree, whose roots are cushioned with moss. They are both naked, and Guts positions himself above Casca. He notices the scars caused by the piercing wounds she received when the band of the Falcon was attacked by Midland's forces. She covers her body, worried that he may not find her desirable due to them. Guts reassures her and tells her that if she focuses too much on the dead or the broken, she will find death perched on her shoulder. He embraces her, and Casca senses that what she feels for Guts is not a lie. They begin to have sex in silence. Due to this, he doesn't realize how roughly he is treating her until Casca asks him to be gentler. When Casca starts screaming, Guts suddenly has visions of his younger self being taken advantage of by Donovan. He recoils from Casca, who calls out to him. Guts doesn't speak. He extends his hands and wraps them around what he believes to be the neck of his younger self. In reality, he is gripping Casca by the neck and has pinned her against the tree trunk, choking her. When he comes to his senses, he releases Casca, but he screams that he never wanted to kill Gambino. He tells Casca about the torment he endured at the hands of Donovan and how he couldn't protect himself. Memories of Guts as a child resurface, and he recounts the story of how he came to be adopted by Gambino and how the same man sold him to Donovan. He admits to killing Donovan and making it look like enemy forces committed the act, and he describes how he defended himself against the drunken Gambino and accidentally killed him. Guts falls to his knees, calling out to Gambino, his adoptive father. Casca touches his shoulder, and he startles violently, snapping back to reality. Suddenly realizing how rough their first time having sex was, he throws his cloak to Casca to cover herself and tells her that he will leave if she asks him to. He explains that the nightmares of Donovan and Gambino hadn't occurred in a year, but they resurfaced suddenly when Casca and he tried to make love. Casca discards her cloak and embraces him from behind. Now that they have mutually revealed their weaknesses and insecurities, she feels much more comfortable. They decide to engage in sex again, and this time it is much more pleasurable. Afterward, Guts recalls the time as a child when he applied Gambino's ointment to his nose wound after Gambino inflicted the same wound on him. Guts and Casca fall asleep in each other's arms, where they remain until dawn. The next morning, Guts and Casca lie naked together and converse. He timidly admits that the previous night was also his first time having sexual relations, and Casca realizes that the trauma caused by Donovan in his youth is the reason Guts has difficulty with being touched. He tells her that she is now the exception, and she kisses his cheek. She then asks him if his return means that Guts wants to stay with the band of the Falcon, but he maintains that his is only a visit and that he will inevitably leave again. Guts looks at the waterfall and remembers his training time during the past year. In a flashback, a young boy cuts a large bundle of logs tied together, causing them to fall down a waterfall toward Guts, who wields his sword. Guts lifts his sword to cut the logs as they descend. When the boy approaches Guts, he realizes that he has been harmlessly struck by the logs and lies in the water with his sword broken. They both head to a nearby mill, where the only male occupant, Godot, repairs Guts' sword. Guts asks the old man why he lives in seclusion with his daughter, and Godot explains that the nearby cliffs, once inhabited by elves, contain a rich mineral. Guts then asks Godot why he became a blacksmith, and Godot responds that it's simply a family business, as he was taught blacksmithing since birth. He greatly enjoys the sparks that fly when striking hot metal. Later, as Guts sits alone on a large rock, he contemplates the solitary quest he has undertaken. He compares his dream to Griffith's, Guts' concept of a dream is much more vague and dynamic than Griffith's, whose dream of having his own kingdom is much more concrete and communicable. Meanwhile, Guts seems to have resolved to live his life by the sword as he always has, remembering that every significant part of his life happened while fighting. He decides to fight not for Griffith or anyone else, but only for himself. In the present, Guts tells Casca how he has achieved what seems to be his own dream of living by the sword. He says he will stay with the band until they rescue Griffith and rebuild the Band of the Falcon, after which he will leave once again. Casca starts laughing, saying he is speaking with the same conviction as Griffith. Suddenly, Casca becomes aggressive, angry with Guts because both his and Griffith's dreams are now selfish in nature and because both dreams will take them away from her. She starts throwing a tantrum but quickly falls silent when Guts grabs her chest, and she retreats in embarrassment. Guts invites her to come along. Now that they have understood their feelings for each other, he wants Casca to stay in his life. They share a morning kiss. 3 days before these events, the rangers of the same forest where Guts and Casca are now found spotted a large monster that had a human body but a snake head. An unstoppable chain of events is about to unfold, with all the pieces falling into place. Griffith remembers when he was with other children on a street, playing war. Griffith looks up at a hill in the center of the city, where a large castle stands. He vows that one day he will have his own castle and his own kingdom. In the present, Griffith's thoughts are jumbled. He doesn't know if he has gone insane or not, or how long it has been since he last saw the light. He remembers how every person he has met has either come to trust him completely or hate him. And although he always seemed to have everyone in the palm of his hand, he feels that he himself was in Guts' palm. When he thinks of his dream, a castle atop the hill, Guts' face also appears, shining brighter than anything else. Griffith wakes up in the dark cell, covered in shadows. A brick in the wall begins to move and is pushed out of its slot. From the hole emerges a small deformed mass of flesh. Griffith extends his broken hand toward the flesh, which refers to him as Prince, and states that it desires an audience with him. Griffith looks through the hole and sees an infinitely vast dimension populated only by 4 inhuman silhouettes. One of the figures addresses Griffith as a kinsman, and King of Longing, telling him that they will soon meet at the agreed moment and place. In their camp, the Band of the Falcon prepares to carry out Griffith's rescue. Although most members will be able to participate, Rickert and several dozen others can't due to their injuries. He expresses hope that Guts will stay with them after saving Griffith. Guts doesn't say anything. Casca has divided the operation into 2 parts, to be handled by 2 squads of people. The first squad is the Griffith Rescue Squad, consisting of herself, Guts, Judo, and Pippin, and a second squad, consisting of Corcus and the remaining unharmed mercenaries. They all ride together toward Wyndham. 3 days later, the Griffith Rescue Squad arrives in Wyndham in the dead of night. As they wander through a graveyard, Judo informs Guts that the band's spies who infiltrated Wyndham have discovered a secret passage to Griffith's prison, bypassing the city streets and guards of Wyndham proper. Casca finds the appropriate tombstone, and Pippin removes it to reveal the previously dug escape tunnel. Guts questions the wisdom of allowing Casca to enter the prison, as she now acts as their leader. In response, she presses her chest against his and, with a flirtatious attitude that surprises Judo and Pippin, scolds him, saying she is one of the best the band has to offer and that her presence maximizes their chances of safely recovering Griffith. With that, Guts, Casca, Judo, and Pippin descend into the escape tunnel. As the members of Griffith's rescue team run through the flooded escape tunnel, Guts reflects on his most significant moments with Griffith and how Griffith is the kind of person who would never give up, driven by his boundless ambition. They emerge from the escape tunnel into a mausoleum deep within Wyndham, where they are greeted by 2 hooded women who have been waiting for them. Casca assures Guts that they are allies. Suddenly, one of them realizes who Guts is and removes her hood. It's Charlotte, in the presence of one of her trusted servants, Anna. It turns out that the informant for the Band of the Falcon was Charlotte herself. At Casca's urging, the whole group begins to move in search of Griffith. As they wander through the dark and empty Wyndham, Casca wonders if Griffith's torture has made him lose interest in Charlotte. Realizing that she is still jealous of the princess, Casca places her hand on Guts, but quickly withdraws it when Charlotte turns to speak to her and apologizes on behalf of her father for Griffith's torture. Suddenly, 2 guards enter the area after hearing their voices. Guts and Judo prepare to fight, but Charlotte steps in front of them, blocking the torchlight from the guards' faces. She convinces the guards that they were simply taking a nighttime walk. Anna steps forward and bribes the guards to keep their secret. The guards leave. Charlotte collapses from nerves, as she had never bluffed like she just did. She wonders if she acted out of devotion to Griffith. The group begins to move again, and Guts jokingly asks Casca if he should hold her hand. She pushes him away but grabs onto his cloak as they walk. Finally, the group arrives at an ancient, large, and imposing tower. Judo explains that the tower, called the Tower of Rebirth, and the prison located far beneath it, supposedly existed before the conception of Midland. Charlotte says that Griffith is being held on the lowest level of the prison. As Casca is about to thank Charlotte and excuse her from their company, Judo interrupts and urges her to keep Charlotte close, as she would be a valuable hostage if needed. Charlotte overhears and willingly requests to be invited along with them. Anna is the first to speak after hearing Charlotte's request. She refuses to let Charlotte infiltrate the prison and pleads with her to consider how hurt her father would be if he found out Charlotte had gone missing. Anna is unaware that the king assaulted his own daughter. Charlotte responds that she no longer considers him her father. She asks Casca again, saying that while she may not be a skilled warrior and knows little of the world outside Wyndham, at least she could be a valuable hostage. Casca refuses, stating that Griffith's escape will lead to a massive pursuit that the Band of the Falcon is ill-prepared to face. Making Charlotte a hostage will personally involve the King of Midland and likely cause a national incident. Furthermore, if Charlotte is taken hostage, it will undermine Griffith's image and completely shatter any hope he has left of fulfilling his dream. Charlotte doesn't accept any of these reasons and starts throwing a loud tantrum, with everyone comically covering her mouth. In the end, Casca decides to take her along on the condition that she must leave if Griffith orders it after they find him. Suddenly deflated, Casca catches Guts' attention as she stares blankly ahead. He asks her what's wrong, and she accidentally blurts out that she feels jealous when she hears how Charlotte talks about Griffith. She quickly apologizes to Guts, unintentionally hurting his feelings, but he shudders at her touch and tells everyone to move forward, thinking that if anyone needs to break free from Griffith, it's him. The entrance of the Tower of Rebirth is being patrolled by 2 guards, whom Judo stealthily kills with 2 throwing knives. He searches the guards and finds a ring full of keys. The group enters the tower. In the Band of the Falcon's camp in the forest, everything is quiet because almost everyone is injured and depleted of energy. Rickert and another band member tend to a wounded man, and Rickert smiles as they both express optimism that their numbers and former glory will quickly recover after Griffith's return. The other mercenary asks Rickert to fetch a bucket of water from a nearby lake. As he bends down to fill the bucket, he notices something shining in the water. At blinding speed, it flies above Rickert toward the shore. Rickert catches a quick glimpse of the creature and believes it to be an elf. It soars through the forest toward the band's camp. Suddenly, Rickert hears a commotion from the same direction. Thinking that enemy soldiers are attacking the camp, Rickert rushes back to his injured comrades. When he arrives, instead of finding the wounded members of the band fighting against the unknown enemy, he finds absolutely nothing. The camp is engulfed in darkness, with only the remains of the campfires providing points of light. There are no enemies or band members. Rickert wanders through the camp, wondering if all the members of the Band of the Falcon managed to escape the assault. Suddenly, he sees one of them, except the man is hanging upside down and desperately pleads with Rickert to run. From behind the man, a huge slug-like monster appears and begins to encircle the terrified Rickert with its considerable girth. Rickert's legs won't move, and with his injured arm, he can't defend himself. From behind him, even more monsters appear, each with its own variety of shape and size. From above, standing on a thick tree branch, the creature that Rickert mistook for an elf appears. As the creatures advance toward Rickert, the Skull Knight appears, seemingly out of nowhere, right behind him. The Skull Knight orders the monsters to leave. He swings his sword toward the slug-like monster. After a moment, all the monsters leave together. Rickert finally finds his voice and uses it to scream at the absurdity of the events. He looks for the mercenaries in the darkness and finds them dead and piled up. He screams once more and is left alone by the departing Skull Knight, whose horse seems to fly through the air, moving away from the scene. And that's how the second part of this manhwa ends. If you've reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you've been one of the few people to make it here, so comment the word monster in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.